evening, everyone, and welcome. This is the Upper Dublin Board of School Directors Operations Committee meeting. It's Thursday, September 14th, 2017. It's 6 p.m., and we're in the Upper Dublin High School Cardinal Room. Welcome to all, and we do have a presentation and several recommendations, so let's get right to it then. First of all, are there any announcements or communications?
Sorry, no announcements tonight. I believe we are working on minutes for October, or excuse me, for August have been prepared, and if you haven't, just
okay.
And if you have any comments or edits that you would like to make, please do so. Thank you, Brooke.
Okay, thank you. And we do have one presentation. It's the Enrollment Projection Study presented by Scott France, Aicp Section Chief of the Montgomery County Planning Commission. Mr. France, welcome. We have them already.
That's the report. I was going to go off of a...
Oh.
Do you have it on your laptops? Oh, great.
Yeah.
Does anyone need a copy? I do have it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, and I know I've talked with Ms. Bray quite a bit. Trying to get here and schedule these conflicts in our schedules, but I've definitely of value to you. So 3 years ago, I was here with our original 2014. Tonight we're back with an update to that study. Back then, that was our third study in the county. We were kind of just ever.
Mr. France, let me stop you.
Yeah.
Because we broadcast this, so we need you to speak into the mic, even though we can hear you. Joe also.
Okay.
Testing. No problem. So I just was going to point out, this is we're now under contract for our 18th study. So it has been a busy 3 years, and I think to our benefit, we've learned a lot over that time, seeing the different districts. We've been in 12 of them, virtually all of them on the eastern side of the county, with one exception or two. So it's interesting to compare what's going on elsewhere, and I can hopefully touch on that a little bit in context of tonight. The actual so study itself, in the enrollment trends, we talk about really the basics, what tends to influence enrollment. Birth activity is certainly a major component, as that brings in the future students. Changes in demographics and population bubbles as they go through also can end up in different cycles of enrollment, and how the population moves in and out of the district, migration, and obviously coming in at different grade levels than being born here is another component to that. And then housing construction is one of the more obvious and more immediate impacts, as they immediately can bring new families. And finally, you can have impact from non-public schools, alternatives of mostly private school, taking more or less students away from the public population. So I'm going to touch first on, if you're following along, slide 3. I wanted to update kind of where we were with the original projections, do some self-analysis a bit, or explain how I interpret where we are now from where we were then. If we look at the chart there, your current enrollment, or when I say current, 2016 to 17, the enrollment was 4,100. We projected in our recommended scenario 4,200, slightly higher. Not far off, within the range that we normally want to be within 3 years out. But also, we can certainly do better. But when you look at the actual details within, some interesting patterns jump out, or factors that influence that. One is the kindergarten class really came out a little bit differently, especially the last couple of years, higher than we expected based on some of the declining birth rate. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail in a moment, but I think that is the obvious immediate concern. However, that was coupled with a bit different occurrence with the middle school and high school, where the projection was slightly higher, and so there was actually a little bit of a balancing effect there. The overall elementary school numbers were almost spot on, 8 off But like I said, looking at the different grade levels, that was, again, counterbalancing within. And that's important to acknowledge and address that going into these updated projections, because over the long term, that'll have a different effect. I also threw in there, just so you see, option 2 was our other scenario without the housing adjustment. And one of the factors that didn't happen quite the way we saw back then, which is hard to predict, is when new development comes online. So a lot of those projects that were about 2 or 3 years out at the time, they're like 3 or 4 years out. Some of them are being constructed right now or have just come in. It didn't come in quite when we were plotting them out in the original adjustment for housing. I also want to mention, I did mention that, okay. So we're going to move into the actual numbers. Well, let me just expand on that just one more moment. With the kindergarten class, I felt that you have, well, I've talked about this before too in the original study, but Upper Dublin itself has very high value of housing and a very homogeneous type of housing. There's less other housing types than single-family detached than you might see in some of the other districts in the eastern side of the county. I think that lends itself to more of your population being second-time home buyers, third-time home buyers, not as many first-time home buyers, because the housing is a bit more expensive here. So you might get families coming in already with children, possibly in the preschool range, but also above. And I think that is evident in the numbers as well, as we'll see. But that, I think, lays into why kindergarten classes didn't go down as much as we had it by formula. So we're going to address that with these projections. And then also on the high school level, this is a bit more of a conjecture, but possibly you had growth in classes going into the high school range 3 or 4 years ago, stemming off of renewed interest, possibly from this fabulous new building at the time. Maybe that's tempered down a little bit from the newness, even though it still looks pretty new. But maybe that could be a change that wasn't seen 4 or 5 years ago that may have played out in the recent years. So keep that in mind. I think those are important to consider. All right, so we're going to move into a general summary. I'm going to go through the major topics here, try to be as brief as possible with them to get out the main points. If we look at slide, I'm numbered here, slide 5, with our population trends. It's interesting that Upper Dublin has grown since 2010. It actually declined a little bit from 2000 to 2010. Some of our other eastern communities also showed that pattern. However, it's interesting, since 2010, everywhere we're seeing growth spurts all over the east. Upper Dublin is very strong in what we've seen so far, but also there's growth in Abington, Cheltenham, down in Lower Merion. There's explosive growth right now. Upper Merion, Colonial District area, Plymouth, all those areas. So, and it reflects, I think, a renewed change in preferences, the millennial generation, a return to more urban amenities, walkability, transit. Those kind of things are, I think, of higher value than they were 50 years ago. So I think that's what you're seeing there. That doesn't always translate to school population or public enrollment, but it's not that far off from what we've seen in Upper Dublin, certainly during the previous decades, where growth and kind of mimicked what the population was doing. We also isolated the groups. You can see school-age children did go down, age 5 to 17. The preschool age, however, if you look at the estimates over the last 4 years, or 11 to 15, we're seeing a little increase there after a decline, and also seeing an increase in the 25 to 34-year-olds, which is, we'll talk about that group a bit, because they are the ones most likely to give birth. So that can also bode for future enrollment growth. So that's, I think, a key thing to recognize off the bat. If you go to the next slide on number 6, we have birth activity, and take in the general pattern by the chart at the bottom. You can see how it was fairly consistent and fairly high for a number of years until dipping down right around the recession or post-recession years, hitting what is probably a historical low for Upper Dublin in 2011. Since then, the last 4 years have rebounded a bit, still below on average what was happening before, but with the exception of a dip in 14, generally stronger birth numbers than had been experienced in those previous years. If you look at the county, somewhat similar pattern in general, the decline in growth, not exactly the same years correlating, but and when we go into the next slide, number 7. Well, I should point to on those birth charts. You'll notice I mentioned the historical low of 2011. I should point out that's the birth year that influences this year's 17, and is also responsible a lot for the mismatch in the original projections. I think that occurred at that time because the birth numbers were so low at that time. We had a what looked abnormally low kindergarten class scheduled in the model. That didn't happen, at least in the last 2 years, and I don't think it's going to happen this year either, based on the preliminary numbers I saw. So again, we'll adjust for that in a bit. If you go to the next slide, again related to birth, but this from the mother's point of view or perspective, females aged 25 to 34, if you look at region-wide, or county-wide I should say, is on the rise, well, and region-wide and national. The millennial generation is providing this boost. You're seeing more females of that age currently, and expected to continue over at least till 2025, where it peaks. That's also likely happening in Upper Dublin. If we look at the numbers at the bottom, if you were to combine the 25 to 29 and 30 to 34, you'd see that there were 1,189 that dropped down to 992 during the decade from 2000 to 2010. Our estimates for 2015 show that number has started to come up again to 1,098. Some rough projection out of that cohort, and we think it could go as high as 1,230 by 2020. So the natural theory here is that birth activity should continue to rise, as it kind of has the last couple of years, and that usually results in kindergarten classes starting to grow, again, 6 years down the line from when those births. Correlation isn't quite as strong here in Upper Dublin, and so we'll again look at that in a moment. If you look at slide 8, that just shows your overall enrollment. It looks like kind of a cycling pattern. It went down, then up a little bit, and then back down again. In reality, there's really only 2 years where there was a last 10-year period. So it definitely overall still reflects a mildly declining enrollment base. If things were to continue on trend, that might be expected to continue. When you look at the slide 9, you can see the grade levels differentiated. It doesn't tell a good story here. A lot of times I do see an inkling of what's going to happen in the projections based on the distribution of students. It's not quite as clear here. And that's plays to the relative stability of class sizes in Upper Dublin. They don't veer quite as much as in most districts. So I think that's an interesting point. Maybe, again, that's due to the more consistent housing types. But you do see elementary school did decline very mildly over the last 3 years. At the middle school and high school, it was a little bit more up and down. Overall, a general decline, but there were some up years mixed in. And a lot of that's following each other, obviously. If middle school goes up, you're going to see that high school when those classes get there. But I just want to point that out and look at the last characteristic on slide 10, other school enrollment. Upper Dublin, like many of our districts in Montgomery County, has shown a general decline in private school attendance. We have 2 data sources. One is the census, one is the school busing data. Neither are completely perfect. The census is probably most useful, just in that it's consistent over time, but it also is subject to a margin of error. These are estimates, and they're based over 5-year intervals. What you can see is that public school students declined in recent years, certainly from the 2010 5-year period to the 2015. There's a large drop by the numbers. Again, take it with a grain of salt with the margin of error. But the decline is clear. And when you match it up with what the district shows in their school busing, which is not going to count every private student, but those that do use the busing option, you also see a reduction in those numbers overall. A little more fluctuation, though, and fortunately that does have some value to us. But overall, we see a general decline that has played into what the public school enrollment has been, and we don't expect any dramatic shift from what's happened recently. Private school attendance. The other 2 options, cyber charter and homeschool, very low numbers relatively. Actually, one went up, one went down, as we detailed in the report, so not a lot of net impact on that side either. We'll go to part 2. Now we'll get into the housing issues, and I think this is where some of the more interesting construction and stuff happening on the ground in Upper Dublin plays out. On slide 12, we outlay what the impact of housing is, looking at it by different types, and we start with a county report that's based on 2010 data from the census, and it's an analysis of every census block that has the same type of housing and how many school-age children are in that census block. When we look at it countywide, we can break it up by detached housing, your standalone housing, attached, your twins and townhomes, and multifamily, your often apartments or condos stacked on top of each other, densest housing type. But you can see countywide, existing units for detached have a lower rate of school children than new units, 0.55 to 0.93 for new. And when we say existing in this case, that means pre-2000, so anything built in the last decade at the time of that study. On attached and multifamily, you see the opposite effect. New housing has less of a school-age children impact than existing older. And it's about half as much on attached, 0.41 to 0.21. And in multifamily, 0.18 for existing. New construction during the 2000-2010 decade averaged out countywide to only 0.06 children per unit. Surprises a lot of people. That's the numbers. Again, it has to be a block that only has that type of housing in it, so you don't get 100% count there, but you get the big developments that tend to take up a block by themselves. And then I want to point out Upper Dublin below, we have data for under the same study, we have the data that applies only to Upper Dublin for existing units. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of new development during that decade, so we don't have numbers that can be isolated and shown on the new construction. On existing, you can see the single-family detached impact is slightly higher than the county at 0.64. Attached is just a tiny bit lower, 0.39, very similar, and multifamily also very similar. Keep in mind, that's about only 50 units that could be measured, and there's not a lot of multifamily developments to measure. But I do want to, we did a separate analysis of the multifamily developments in Upper Dublin. Before I cover that, I wanted to touch on really what's happening with multifamily in the county, especially with new construction. The question gets asked a lot, especially as during the proposal process. What is the impact of this? How is this going to, affect? So we look at these numbers, and yes, 0.06 is very low. That, of course, a developer will trot that out, immediately and say, the county endorses this. Well, we might, but there are different types of multifamily housing. And first off, I think the reason that number is so low is you look at what's been built recently. A lot of it is more expensive, luxury apartments. The beginning of the decade was more condos, but it turned into apartments, and now it's all apartments. And you see it more suited to young professionals, often built near employment centers, more urbanized. It's infill development. All the big tracts are gone, so this is where they redevelop. Maybe it was a former non-residential site or something else. Take Conshohock in White Marsh. But that's what you're seeing, and so the market base for the people moving in likely don't have children. And a lot of them are built, frankly, with smaller units, 1 bedroom, a few 2 bedrooms. So we looked at a couple. Park Apartments stands out. That's not far from here. It's right off the turnpike near Plymouth Meeting Mall. They have 398 units that came in 2015. We did a study for the Colonial District, so we learned that upon opening there was only 10 children, but there was probably a lot of vacancies at that time. By 2016-17, they had 24 students once it was pretty much at occupancy, and so that rate turned out to be exactly 0.06. Well, it's new. We'll see if that goes up at all in future years. But it was interesting to see it play out that way. Not all developments come that way. We looked at Station Square, which is in Upper Gwynedd, built a few more years ago around 2008, I believe. They're at 0.15 as last year. It's a different kind of multifamily. It's more garden style, a mix of other housing types as well nearby. Not the denser tower type with other non-residential uses immediately by. There's more open space. You could picture yourself living there, I think, with children and still have, the lawn to play in and that kind of thing, which isn't always the case in some of these. Another one, to contrast, in Lansdale nearby there is like the Silk Factory Lofts, which is industrial property, not a lot of outdoor green space, more a little bit of plaza area. There's like 0.03 children per unit. So we see it becomes pretty clear. Once in a while you hit an exception. There's more children than you might expect somewhere or less. But overall, especially you look at the Conshohocken housing and Spring Mill, very few children have shown up there. The only surprise really has been that you're seeing empty nesters move into these places as well and downsizing from their home. It's appealing to some as a way of simplifying their life and having a different kind of living experience. So I wanted to touch on that, and back to slide 13. We did look at what turned out to be 3 properties in Upper Dublin that have more than 10 units in our multifamily. They're listed in the report with full details. We measured them over the last 7 years or so at different intervals. Surprisingly, in many of our other eastern districts, we're seeing the number of students coming from older apartment complexes really burst in the recent years. In Lower Merion, they more than doubled over about 6 years. Same thing in Upper Merion, Colonial, growth also in Abington and Cheltenham. So in Upper Dublin, we did not see that growth. It's only 470 or 458 units, but you can see by the numbers there, it was at 0.14 for those 3 developments. 2 of them built in the 70s, Butler Park, I think that was built in the 80s actually, the Woods, and Elliger Park. The Woods actually has declined from 2009, and then it went back up again, but it's lower than it was in 2009, now at 49 students. So you're not seeing that impact here. Will you? I'm surprised if it hasn't happened now. There might be other reasons. I don't know the developments beyond that level. Worth looking at, and something we wanted to include here. Again, the overall impact is not as large here because of the fewer numbers. Going to slide 14. Another analysis that's new to this update we weren't able to do before, again using generic student rosters, or anonymous student rosters, I should say, by address alone. First off, we noticed the number of housing sales, which is illustrated by the graph there. Upper Dublin has rebounded more strongly than I can't think of another municipality in the county that has had a stronger rebound. Their current level of sales in 2016 was higher than it was in 2007. And again, I don't think I can say that about anywhere else. So there's certainly a strong market going on here. Maybe it's also playing into the population that a lot of people are moving into that age where they moved in 20 years ago, and children are growing up, and so you're seeing a little more. But I think that's interesting to note. So we looked at those sales and then looked at our sales records by address and then the rosters to determine what was happening at each sale. We could identify if a student came in because of the sale or left because of the sale. You can see those numbers from 2011 through 2016, and they had a net positive impact towards growth each of those years. And the most recent year actually had a little bit more of a jump than the previous 3. But I think there's a consistency there, taking on some growth just by the activity in sales. Implications of which?
I'm sorry, that most recent number is positive 34, right?
Actually, 44 is what I have here. I think that's correct.
Yeah.
Do you have something else?
Yeah. If you look at the difference of incoming and outgoing, it's a difference of 34.
One of those 3 numbers is wrong.
You are correct. And that's probably, I guess you're looking at the report too, right?
Okay.
Yeah, I'll double check. So it is either 34 or 44. I guess the message is still the same.
Yeah.
Thank you for catching that. And yeah, so again, it's the consistency that we look for. See if there's any dramatic shifts. At some point you might start to see a difference where it's not a decline, or just a decline in the number of units. I think is what you should be looking out for more than anything. If it's not due to some dramatic market correction, then it might be, again, that shifting of generations within the township. Going over to slide 15. Housing construction. This shows the activity of units built for the last 10 years since 2007. You can see not a lot has gone on construction-wise, with the major exception of in 2011. However, that is the Dublin Terrace development, bleeding over a little bit into 2012, and those are all age-restricted units. So we kind of put those aside and know that the impact of those on school-age students is negligible. Otherwise, you see every year except the most recent, the number of units was below 20, which is a very low issue. You're a well built out community, and there hasn't been a lot of redevelopment. However, there are some coming. And you also see most of it has been detached housing, which does have the higher impact on school-age children. So the purpose and the use of this in our eyes, other than just understanding what's happened, is we boil this down to impact. Again, using those factors of school-age children, we show that this housing alone equates to 5.6 school-age children. However, we boil it down further and look at what's coming from actual developments, what's coming from like single development, and have a factor then to weigh against what we expect to happen over the next 5 years, so that our housing adjustment is more realistic and accounts for the trend infill development that you'll still expect. But that is the use of that. On the next slide, you can see a map of the housing construction. Again, not a lot of units, but you see where they're clustered and where there are developments. The other kind of large cluster you see up towards the top of the township is the Toll Brothers development. Escaping me right now, but that started Regency, right? And that is they had about 14 units built at the end of 16, with about 100 total coming in. Those are age restricted as well. I didn't see any impact in 2016-17. They're larger houses, so once in a while you will see a child living with a 55 plus, but so far. If we turn to the next slide, so now we get into the potential housing development, or expected housing development, as I should say. And I won't go through all of them because I probably can't read them at this scale. But there's notes on when we expect the construction, where the current status is of those. I know Anna Rose Court I was going to lead with. That was mostly built. In fact, it's probably done now. They had 4 units finishing up. However, those 4 didn't impact the last school year. They would have impacted this school year. So they're figured into the adjustment and the projection as you. Otherwise, some of these were on the slate 3 years ago, and some of and expected to be built by now. But most of them haven't. St. Mary's, the Madison Estates is, I think, the largest example. And there's a few new ones. The Promenade, the Ruddy Tract, I think, is the most distant one. And I'll have you switch to the next slide where we list these as well, page 8 or slide 18. This is a chart, shows all those developments that we have confidence will be developed, and we want to account for their impact. Also, the years where we now are figuring them to be built. I think one thing I've learned over the last 3 years is add a year from whatever the manager tells you it's going to be, and it maybe more. But we do consider that and see what it might be. The Promenade's a tough one. That one actually I think just got preliminary approval. Those mixed-use projects don't happen overnight, so you never know if more delays come down the road with it. We have it slated for 2019 through 21. That's your only multifamily development. So that's one where we thought, well, do we go with the 0.06? And you'll see on that chart to the right is the total public school children impact, just from the factor calculation, and that factor used for that housing type is listed to the right. We'll adjust the factor if we think there's a strong reason to do so. Attached and detached, we didn't. We basically went with the county averages. And then with the Promenade, we really thought that fit the character of what was happening with the similar type developments, although it is a bit unique. We've been waiting for one of these like completely internal mixed-use developments that have 300 units on top of retail. There's a park built in, so see if that has appeal. But it's creating that faux little Main Street shopping center with lots of parking lots. Personal editorial there. But it's interesting. We'll see. So I think the school attractiveness to families is still going to be low. I'm pretty confident they're going to be pretty expensive. And in most places, when you have luxury apartments, 2,000 plus, there's other options to buy housing. So you don't, if you're a family, you might say, well, I can also live here and have the yard or the play space or whatever, or more space. And again, Upper Dublin, maybe it shifts a little bit because there aren't as many first times. But again, I just don't see a lot of families living in that development. So those are the impacts. We then adjusted internally for the infill development, and you get down ultimately to the final figure there of about 76 school children. Everything gets built out as scheduled, essentially within 5 years. Then you're looking at 76 more students. We extend that a little bit into the second 5 years of the projection period, knowing that other development could occur. Not at the same level as this. This is much higher of a level than you have had previously, and we think it'll likely come down a little after this. Glad to come back in 5 years and see if that's the case.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
For the factor that's used for Madison Estates, I see it's 0.21. So I know the project has changed over the last couple of years about the housing that they've proposed, and I was just wondering if that was updated, if you knew if that was updated, because initially it had carriage homes, townhouses, and condos. Then they slashed the condos and made more townhomes in that. So that's why I'm just wondering if the factor was, if that was considered when assigning the factor to that one.
Yes. So we went with the plans get submitted at our office once they're official. So we went with that and also talked to the manager to confirm where they stood now. So we had what I think are still the condo units are all age restricted. Or maybe they're twins as well, or townhomes as well, I'm not sure.
250 apartments, and that's remained the same. And it was originally 40 condos. It was originally 34 twins, 54 townhomes, and 40 condos. And then they got rid of the condos, and now it's going to be 72 townhomes and 32 twins, and they're all of substantial size. So.
Right. So we did have the correct number of units, 104. Both of those are considered attached housing types. Twins, you're right, you might see a boost compared to the others. Will it be over 0.21? We didn't make that judgment call. Wanted to consider that, then that you look at the growth impact, about 18.5 students. If it went up to as much as, say, 0.3, then you'd be probably right around 28 students.
Thanks.
Moving to the the end result of the study, the district enrollment projections, on slide 20. We use a cohort progression model. Essentially, it tracks each class as they move through the system and assigns them a progression rate. And then you have a whole matrix of progression rates and take averages. And how you set it up really helps dictate the results of that model, in addition to any adjustments that are made. So we ended up setting 3 scenarios, but first I'll show you the progression rates on slide 20. You can see from the last 4 years, this is one of the decisions you make with the model, how much of the past are you going to account for to say this is the trend that's happening. The first study we went with 6 years, which is kind of where we generally start and look at if we know something's going on, and certainly a few years back with the recession, it was hard to really, you wanted to expand the area because you didn't know exactly which area was forming different results or different impacts. So now we've been in a more consistent post-recession era, but I think it's safe going only 4 years. And when you look at the rates themselves, it makes a lot of sense at most grade levels. You see more of a consistency within those. Some aberrations, some peaks that do occur, and you want to kind of balance that out with what might be on the recent year end without going too far back before getting trends that might be relevant anymore. So we went with 4 years, which is really as small as you'd like to go. If something really happened that 4 years ago, you might consider going smaller. What's interesting is first you see a lot of 1.0 plus numbers. That means it's common in a quality district where people are moving in and adding to a class on average year after year. As you get in the older years, sometimes you start to see that change. In high school years, you might see a drop at the upper grades as you do here. 1 year in between the 5th to 6th grade, there was, on average, a slight decline. Most of that was just due from the last year. So essentially, it's still kind of an even wash, and not very. But what jumps out is the birth decay ratio. So here we have to unfortunately take the birth to kindergarten, 6 years in between, because we don't know what happens in between. And Upper Dublin is very unique in the height of that number. 1.334 was the average. In recent years, it's been as high as 1.45. My understanding from the preliminary numbers for this upcoming year, it went even higher than that. It's very unusual. Most often, districts are below 1.0 because not every student is going to be a public student that's born, and there's a lot of transition that happens in between. What this shows, again, is the draw and of families, again, most likely at families that have already started out and might already have children. And so you're seeing that stronger now than it was. If you go back further, that number starts to go down. You have to go about 10 years back before it finally breaks back under 1.0. I've been on this rise. I don't think that even 1.4, and even if it's higher this year, I don't really think that's sustainable just from a numbers standpoint for a long period, that you're eventually going to see it correct and come back. In fact, when I talked to Brenda about it originally, we thought it might come back this year, and then we found, nope, not quite. But then when we couple this with the birth information that I was talking about earlier, the historic lows, we can see, well, if we're going to tie kindergarten completely to that birth number, we're missing out on this trend where it's still staying high. So what we did was we took this kindergarten class for this year, the 2017 school year, and we were also aided by the knowledge that we had an idea of the preliminary registration in. And we looked at the average kindergarten size over the last 4 years and came up with a number that we thought was more appropriate, that was well above, probably by about 40 students, what the birth decay ratio would have been, because that was also the 2011 birth year that was so abnormally low at that time. So we did that for 2018 or 2017. I looked at the other years. I didn't see as much of a mismatch. The birth numbers came back up after that year. So you're essentially getting a more consistent level of kindergarten keeping pace, even though with the birth activity. So basically we're admitting that there's less of a connection there with birth decay, and like the fact that it's tied more consistently, at least for the next 5 years. Now, we do think births are going to go up. We do think that the district will still continue to be a draw. And so you'll see higher kindergarten classes in the 6 to 10 year period out, we call the secondary period. So I want to touch on that. When we look at slide 21, this describes the 3 options that we created with the enrollment projection model. The first is what you could basically call a baseline. Makes no adjustment. It uses the future births based on the average of the last 4 and ties that. We still, on all of these options, we still changed that 2017 kindergarten to keep it consistent with what we expected and partially. With option 2, we accounted for an increase in births during the second 5 years, which is now the current upcoming 5 years, essentially, starting in 2016. And so what we did there is saying, okay, we think kindergarten classes are going to grow. Usually I'll say based on birth activity, but I've already admitted that it's not quite closely correlated here. I think the net effect is going to be the same, though. Whether they're coming from somewhere else, I think you're going to have just the fact that there's that many current millennials that are having children, that there will be a population bubble there, although not quite as strong. Take 1-to-1 ratios of other generations. Still, the sheer numbers of them are going to create more children, and they're going to be created holistically, not just in overall. So I think the general pressure, the market-based aspect of it, if you will, is going to continue to still offer the potential for more children and boost those kindergarten numbers a little bit 6 to 10 years after this. On option 3, we kept that higher future birth estimate, which we think is the realistic and more likely than just keeping it at the average level. And we added the housing adjustment, which obviously we feel strongly that should be accounted for, since we do know that some of it is getting built now. Again, things can change, but now if it gets built, this is what it does, and can adjust further if things change. But that's our recommended scenario, and that adds it in. When we put all the scenarios together, you can see the comparison, and that's on slide 22. We're starting with last year's enrollment of 4,100. If you look at the option 1 baseline, we still have an overall decline after 10 years, going to down about 112. Add in the higher future births, you start to see growth in that second 6 to 10 year period, while the primary period, the first 5 years, is the same since births haven't affected that. And then option 3, where we had the housing adjustment on top of it, we then see slight growth in the first 5 years, but even more growth over the entire period, and ending with a lot of growth, but it's still 90 students more, which reverses. 3 years ago, it was a downward trend. We had 300 people leaving. We think that you actually declined more than that in the short term, but over the long term, things are positioning themselves where that's going to stop the decline and start. That's what these numbers show. If you go to slide 23, here we break it down basically year by year. I certainly don't want to read through that. What I put on the right there is the option 3, which again is our recommended scenario, the annual change. And you can see, even though it's fairly moderate, the first 5 years, there are changes in between. We have the biggest drop off 2 years from now in 2018, or a year from now at this point, at negative 32. And that's largely due to an existing bubble in the 11th grade this year that will head out and cause a slight decline. And then the growth starts to come up in the middle period in 2020, and mostly through the back end with only 1 year. Again, as projections and our best guess, I think the overall trend is. If we break it down onto slide 24, looking at the elementary school level, taken in total, it's a very stable outlook for the near term. Slight growth overall, about, I think that's 11 students. Next 5 years, and then again kicking in those higher kindergarten classes and first grades in the second half. That's where we're showing the growth at that point. Even without the adjustments, looking kind of at the baseline trend, you see a pretty moderate picture overall, staying about even over the 10-year period. On the middle school breakdown, middle school and high school both look more cyclical. That's evident because of the nature that there are fewer grades. So you get one in the 6th grade that's larger than normal or smaller than normal, and 2 years later that class is leaving and causing the opposite effect, whether it grew or shrunk because of it in the first place. Now again, you don't have huge bubbles because of the consistency of grades overall, but you see that play out in the projections, a little bit of up and down. Overall, the change is a net change of 10 for the middle school. High school, some decline at 74 overall, mostly during, again, the second half, but a few drops over the next 3 years. So a lot of that, at those levels, a lot of it plays into your existing class sizes, and we have a bit of a buffer over the next 5 years. We kind of know what's coming down the line from what's here now in the elementary level, but then you start to see. That's the end of the district-wide projections. I'm going to also mention very briefly, we have elementary school profiles. So in the report, each elementary school has a breakdown. These projections, in this case, we're calling them forecasts. They're a bit more narrative in structure. In the report, we've presented a good amount of data that we could apply to each area, specifically to each area, such as the housing, both sales, construction, and activity. Also very important in understanding what's going to happen is your existing class sizes start there. And what you see on each page is a general idea of what's going based on these factors. We do plot out models. Models, you got to take a big grain of salt at this level because there's fewer students involved. You don't have exact birth data or knowledge of the kindergarten size variations beyond. So there's a little bit of crossing your fingers with that. But taking into account with the data we do know, we still want to make an informed guess of what's going to happen. And as you can see in the summary on slide 28, not a lot of difference overall. We had a couple, Fort Washington and Jarretttown, both expected over 5 years to gain 5 to 15 students, and Maple Glen and Fitzwater to gain 0 to 10. Some of those, especially Jarretttown and Fitzwater, are impacted by some potential development. Otherwise, they might see a decline. They may see a decline over the next 2 years before that growth kicks in. Maple Glen, we expect a bump this year, and then be probably the most stable of the elementary schools. Fort Washington, a slight drop, and then States is going to start pushing. So I'd be happy to talk more about those, but I just wanted to let you know how that was structured and the meaning. But that does bring us to the end. In conclusion, I think I just made up the points. Really, the housing construction is an important factor. With driving definitive new growth. But also, we think with this kindergarten change and being cautious in how we set up the models and looking at the this time around, I think Your sales market's strong, like I said, that really stood out. So I think you're countering what otherwise might be a little decline based on just the general population.
Thank you. I really appreciate this report, and I definitely appreciate the increased detail and data from the earlier report 3 years ago. A few questions. One is, for when new children are moving into the district or for new developments that may be attracting new children, how do you distribute those hypothetical children across the grades? Or is that just captured in the growth, I forget, not the retention rate, you had a different term, but the
Progression rates.
progression rate, yeah. Is that where that is, or is there, how mathematically are they represented?
The trend-based aspect of that is built in, within the progression rate. However, when we make the housing adjustment, that distribution is done equally across grades. And we'll look at, we didn't have a large pool of, sometimes with the multifamily, which tends to be the newer development in some of these other communities, we're able to identify if there's a preponderance of different class or grade splits. In Upper Dublin, in some cases, we feel we're best off just going equally, and it doesn't always come in like that, so that can be a source of.
Okay. In the overall projection for your recommended model, that over 10 years you're looking at 90 students. That's, in my mind, that's not a lot. I mean, still, would we call that fairly flat? Like in the greater scheme of school districts, is that?
Yeah, in our biggest growth communities right now, we're seeing upwards of 1,000. Some have grown them. Lower Marion's grown 1,500 in the last 9 years, and they have 1,000 more coming. Upper Marion, Colonial, those are the other two big ones. And then we're seeing several hundred in places like Abington and Cheltenham, or Moreland even, I think about 200, and that's a small district.
So fairly flat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And could you just clarify in more detail, how do you measure, so you're characterizing Upper Dublin's housing market as strong.
I guess I'm basing that on activity, number of sales. So if prices are down, my impression, we also do price studies, so I have that data. But as far as price goes, I don't know specifically where Upper Dublin stands. I think communities like it, and generally in the East, we've seen some growth in recent years, but a lot of them dropped, after the.
And is that number of sales of existing homes, or does that include new development?
That is just existing homes.
Okay, great.
We account for that separately in new homes.
Thank you very much.
Joan?
When you do your estimates of how many children are going to be in developments, do you use things like number of bedrooms? I mean, some of the other studies that I've seen using projections, I mean, you could use square feet, but really number of bedrooms after the first is often used. Do you use that?
We don't, and I'll tell you why. What you generally see when it comes to factors of children is what's called the Rutgers study, which was back in the middle of the last decade. They've done some updates for different states. We don't use the Rutgers numbers. I don't believe they're very accurate for Montgomery County. Sometimes if they're all you have, then it's all you have. But in a lot of cases, we saw higher numbers coming and then we compared it to what we saw in 2010, and they weren't, they were much higher than what we actually saw happening in real developments. Those numbers are very fine-tuned and broken down across a whole bunch of levels, and gets into even higher level statistics. Their PhDs credit more than myself, but they break it down to that degree, and you also have to know what the new housing is coming in at, which we don't always know what bedroom split, especially on.
Well, like that was a factor in trying to estimate in the promenade when there were discussions about, whether it was going to get approved or not.
And if it's available, then I do think that should be used. Unfortunately, like I said, with the census data, we don't get that breakdown, but we feel more comfortable unless we know that it's abnormal, and it's like if we knew the promenade was going to be all 3 bedrooms,
I don't know the numbers exactly, but it is available, at least. They haven't committed, but they've committed to a max number of, and it's all 1 and 2 bedrooms, and they committed to a max number of 2 bedrooms to keep those numbers.
Last proposal I saw, yeah, it was very, very weighted smallly. So,
Yeah.
and that again, like favors a more conservative or smaller projection. All right.
Okay.
So I guess my concern is that I see what the numbers are projected for this current school year. And of course we know how many kids are in our classrooms right now.
Almost. Because October 1st would be
Right.
the actual.
Right.
Yeah.
October 1st is the cutoff. That I do know. But right now, our actual number, as of Monday from our board report, we have 4,128 kids. And the projection for this year is at 4,087 kids. So I don't expect to lose 150 kids in the next couple weeks. And I see that along the actual numbers versus the projected numbers the actual numbers are higher for all the elementary school, the middle school, and the high school kids than all the projected numbers. So that just makes me concerned about where we are on a 5-year projection if the numbers for this current school year are off.
That's a good point. I think the 150 I think was misstated. If we're at 4150 or so, I'm sorry, 40.
4128 is our actual.
That's about 30.
That's last year. 28.
Right. The projection was 4095.
Oh, well, I was using one of the options. There was 3 options. Okay.
So,
Thank
yes,
you.
and I
Sorry.
saw even in the
Thank-
preliminary, which was slightly under. I think last I saw was 41. So at that point we thought, well, there might be a few more that come in at the very last minute. Between now and October 1st, you might lose a few too, or that you had in earlier numbers. Maybe Brenda has any insight on that, but yeah, it looks like it's going to be a little bit under. So, we could, what we considered, could we do the same thing we did for that kindergarten and try to tweak it more towards that? I declined without thinking at the time it might only be 10 to 15 off, because sometimes that again has a counterbalancing what the average numbers show one year can work the other way the next year, and ultimately you're still
Scott,
pretty
the
close.
important thing with that,
Yeah.
even though if we're off 33 students or whatever, it really depends on what grades they're in. I mean, I was surprised. I believe we picked up a number of kids in 11th and 12th grade, maybe around 15 total. So that's not going to do much to this. If they were all in the earlier grades, then it would affect us significantly. So there's a lot to look at.
True, and that shows that you just said those 2 grades alone are the ones that usually in the past have declined.
I've been negative.
Right.
And
So that is
11th and 12th grade
in
was
the
up.
near term. That is a big impact. So
Yeah.
I guess, but yeah, you're right.
Any other comments?
Just so that everyone is aware, Scott and I were looking at the numbers, and I look at them, or administration looks at them, in 2 different ways, enrollment every week. And a week before school started, we were still, I think, at 4,008, and then 4,108, and then we went to 4,111, and then when school opened, we're now at, as we saw on Monday night, 4,128. By that point, it was a little bit late to try to, give any more current information. But I do want to emphasize that has been, in some years, a decrease during September. So we'll see what happens. And Dr. Levinowitz's point is absolutely correct. It was unusual. I've never seen it happen in all my years to see more people coming in at really the tail end of high school.
All right, any other questions, Joan?
This is really not a question about what you presented, but we did have mention housing prices. I don't know if that's easily available.
Yeah, it's. I could look up on my phone right now. It's on our website. We have a report that shows that. Like I said, I'm pretty sure you've had appreciation recently. Like I said, the big drop off was a number of years.
I think
Brenda,
I'm
you can get that,
seeing that I'll follow up with Scott, make sure
Okay.
that I can get the information and share that.
It'd be interesting to get it for some of the other school districts, so you can see if, you know, ours are going up or down.
I can
more
tell you that
or
the
less.
county-wide increase was about 15,000 in the median overall. A lot of more communities than not were showing an increase.
That's great. Well, thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. We appreciate it. I guess the bottom line basically is that while we've seen some modest decrease over the last 10 years or so with the housing changes in the district, we'll see a rebound over the next 10 years, but it's well within what we can handle as a school district, and so we're in good position for that. I guess one of the things we'll have to look at on an ongoing basis is the number of students in an individual elementary school. That could be an issue if we had, you know, a lot of growth in one school as opposed to the others. But other than that, I think we're very stable, and this report helps us to know that. We appreciate that.
And I told Mrs. Bray that was jumped out at me too. The stability level is, you know, especially the elementary schools, is more consistent than.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, that brings us to our facilities recommendations. The first one is the Maple Glen Elementary chilled water system.
Yes, the cooling tower at Maple Glen Elementary has reached the end of its life. We've been patching it to keep it going the past few years, so it's time to start looking at a new cooling tower. Engaged DJ Vervarelli Incorporated consulting engineers. I've worked with them in the past. We met preliminary to look at the cooling tower, but as we went on, we raised more questions. So they've submitted a proposal to take a look at the entire cooling system at Maple Glen and come back to us with options. You know, it might not make sense to replace the cooling tower and leave the chiller. It might make sense to replace them in combination because the chiller is aging. Older refrigerant that's not as readily available, so the price is higher if there's a leak to repair it. So it might make sense to look at these upgrades. So some of the things we want to look at also, what can the existing piping system handle? Do we have options to increase the cooling capacity of the school to cool more rooms? So these are all options we want to dig into. So they've given us a proposal to do that study to come up with options for us to choose from looking into the future for additional air conditioning at Maple Glen. And the cost to that proposal is $15,000. And that'll come back to us with options of which direction we are feasible for us to look into.
Good. I imagine, you know, we're looking at not only replacement, but potential growth of the system, depending on how much we could be air conditioning in the future, and how we might go about that, whether it be replace to the size we'd need now and with some sort of options to increase the size later. So yeah, there's so many potential options. I do think expert opinion is necessary.
And the big thing I'm going to come up with is what would the cooling load for the entire building be? Being that it's existing piping, what can that existing piping handle? Because we know it was originally designed as a heating system with the options for cooling into it, so we'd have to shut down the heating system and turn on the cooling system. So what can those pipes carry to cool the entire building? And also electric capacity, which I don't think will be an issue here, but is something that we'll take a look at also.
Any comment or question on this?
When do we expect them to deliver their report? I don't see it in the contract. I might just be missing it.
No, I don't believe that was in there. This should be a fairly quick report. I would think this is something that could be turned around 60 days. Because if we do need to design a system to go out to bid, as is in our 5-year plan, we would need this information to put a bid package together very quickly. They do have all the information on the building. They're just waiting for the go-ahead.
Other comment or question? Okay, to move along to legislative. All right. The second item is the elementary school feasibility study.
In working with, looking at our capital future plans and working with DJ Vervarelli again, I just received the final proposal today, so we're still vetting it, really not ready to present that with the numbers. But they want to look at the elementary schools. Is there an option that we can do now for cooling that would not affect any renovations in the future? Any system we put in wouldn't be removed. One of the areas that we're looking at is our large group areas in the schools, the cafeterias, gymnasiums, spaces where you can put a large number of students on a hot day to get a break from if the rooms are too warm for different activities that occur. So we want to look at each of the schools. What can each school handle system-wise, what the capacities would be, and we would give us recommendations as well, where we, what can be added to the schools. And one of the things we want to make sure is that we don't put anything in that down the road as we do renovations is going to have to be removed. These are systems that once they're installed for very long terms.
Comment or questions on this?
I think it's certainly a worthwhile investigation to do. At the same time, I'd also like to see us investigate in a formal way more passive approaches for the rest of the buildings, whether that's, I'm just throwing out ideas, not suggesting specifics, but whether it's white roofs or awnings or shading or window films or, all those possibilities that are not air conditioning to cool the spaces that we're not talking about in this.
Okay, it's something we can handle as well.
Thank you.
And just an aside, I know when we were building this school, the color of the walls make a difference, because if you don't need as much light, it's less heat that's generated that then you would have to chill in order to bring it down in temperature. So there's a number of things like that, passive things, along with the...
There are many areas, vegetation, paving,
Yeah.
what's the paving that we have alongside the classrooms, is that reflecting heat into the rooms?
Yeah.
We do have many options we can look into.
Would that be part of the feasibility study?
At this time, no.
No. Okay, so that's a separate.
Something we can do separately.
Okay.
So,
Right.
so there's going to be a feasibility? I mean, you have somebody that's working on that, you said?
Yes, again, DJ Vervarelli.
Yeah,
I
okay.
received the proposal maybe an hour before the meeting, the final proposal, so I was still going through it. And there's different options that we could choose from. If there's different pricing ranges, if you're looking at Fort Washington, Thomas Fitzwater, and Jarretttown at the same time is one price. If you're looking at each school individually, because they would be splitting the work up, it would be increased pricing. You're looking from a range of $16,000 to $21,000, but I'm still vetting through the entire proposal.
Okay, so what's the next step? Are you going to bring that back here?
I will bring that
Yeah,
back.
back
Yes,
here.
this is something that we do have time to look into. If we get into the 5-year capital plan,
Yeah.
you're still about 3 to 4 years out before we would do any work like that, but at least we can get a start and know which direction we can plan.
All right, very good. Next item is the pool heater repairs.
Yes, do not want to be reporting on this again, but we did discover another problem. Right before Labor Day, we do inspections with the fire marshal where we walk through the buildings. We check all the rooms for safety. One of our stops was the pool heater room. While I was in there, I noticed an error code had come up on the ignition. So we called our service company, RJ Walters, who's been working on that heater for us. I told him I believe there was an ignition problem. Could you please come out? He opened up and confirmed there was an ignition problem, but unfortunately what caused the ignition problem was the igniter had gotten wet. Wasn't sure where the water was coming from, so we had to disassemble the unit, and we did find a leak in the heat exchanger. It wasn't a significant blowout like we've had in the past, but it was a leak enough that it was dripping on other components. So we have shut the heater down. Fortunately, since the last time this had happened, we had looked at other options. What are we going to do if this occurs again? So we had a plan in place. We worked with Deep Run Aquatics. They came up with a design. So we have, unfortunately, 2 temporary pool heaters. We're not far away. These are smaller outdoor units, 400,000 BTU each. And they'll take a little bit longer to warm the pool up than a 2 million BTU unit would, which is a little oversized for the space to begin with. So we're able to get them on site very quickly. we've been using Hirschberg Mechanical as a local contractor to work on installation. Our electrician's been helping them with the wiring. We're also working with the township because the temporary heaters are considered a new installation. So we are going through the same process as we would for permitting. We're working with them to expedite our issues. They know what we're faced against. As of tonight, the heaters are piped in, the gas is connected, and the electric is there. We haven't done any startup yet. We want the Deep Run Aquatics there as they start to tune it up, and I'm also would like the township there. Talking with them again tomorrow morning. We had single line diagrams for the gas lines finished for them. They wanted to see that, and also our electrical underwriter sign off was completed. That's sitting at code inspections. We'll pick that up first thing in the morning. So we should have the entire package handed to the township, the items that they're requesting tomorrow morning, and hopefully we can get them to come out and give their blessing as well.
Okay. Now you say this is a temporary.
This is a temporary solution. We're digging into the heater. Again, using Vervarelli, they had gotten hold of a company, BJ Tirani, who's the local representatives for Lochinvar products. We had them out here. I have too many questions right now for them. The biggest question is, why did our first heat exchanger last 5 years and the next two only last 7 months?
Is that under warranty?
That's where the fight is going to be. They're claiming if they open it up and there's scale inside that they're going to blame us for that. Deep Run, the first thing, as soon as I notified we had a problem with the heater, they came and grabbed our logbooks, and they went through our logbooks looking for anything that could be out of sorts on our chemical balance in the pool, and everything is right in line where it should have been. So the pool water chemistry was not an issue. That's eliminated. Some of the items we're looking into is the actual make of the water heater, the composition of the heat exchanger. So we've cut a piece of that out. We've sent that out to take one of the older ones, not the one that's currently there. We cut out and sent it out to have a look at, is it the correct metal that it's supposed to be? We don't understand what's going on. We did increase the pool flow with the new impeller. When they did the startup of the heater, we were getting the correct temperature differentials that you would expect to see with the proper flow. We didn't have the issues this time that we had leading up to the last failure. We also replaced a three-way valve that was acting up that could have diverted water away from the heater. That was replaced as well in the spring, just to make sure that everything, we're keeping this proper flow through. So we're not in a hurry to go ahead and say fix this because I don't trust that another one from the same company would go again. The temporary heaters are going to buy us options, time to look at options. Whether or not we replace this with a completely different style unit, do we go out more smaller outdoor units where we stage the capacity, so if we do lose one, we're not down for the entire system. So we have a lot of options, and the temporary system that we're putting in, this temporary backup system, is going to buy us time to make the right decisions moving forward.
Okay. Okay, great. A lot of questions.
More questions than answers.
Yeah, we could spend the next hour just talking about that, but I know that there's a lot that you're delving into right now, and just report back to us as you find things and get answers. Yeah, it's a situation that can't go on the way it's been. So I appreciate all the hard work you're doing to keep everything going.
Unfortunately, with Deep Run being on board, they had the plan in place for us. So this has been a conversation since they've come on board with the service contract. What do we do next time? They had the layout already taken care of. This is what you're going to need to do, and we're able to pull the parts off a shelf for us. They weren't local, but they were very close, and we had them within a day.
Two questions. How the temperature? How different? What's the temperature now compared to where we want it to be? And also, are we keeping our user groups informed in terms of the situation and when we expect to be back up?
Yes. As soon as the heater went down, we notified all of our user groups, let them know that we're working on a plan. At that point, we knew we were going to go with a backup heater system, so we let them know we're trying to give them a good time frame. We normally keep the pool heat, the pool temperature 81 degrees. We've been watching it. Fortunately, with the outdoor weather, we're not losing as much through the ground. The temperature's better. We have lost temperature today. When I looked at it, we're at 76.3 as of this afternoon is what the pool temperature maintained. So we have lost just about 5 degrees. It's cooler than we want. We've been checking in, stopping in with the coaches to find out how many complaints we're getting. I think the past few days as the water's dropped, I think you're seeing some more complaints as well. The water does have a chilly feel to it now, but hopefully Monday we'll see a temperature difference on the increase. Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to weigh in and say if the decision is to not continue with the existing heater that seems to enjoy failing, the idea of separating into 3 or more heating units such that the loss of one only loses, a third or a quarter or whatever of your heating capacity seems like a good lesson learned from this experience. I'd be curious about the cost differential of multiple smaller units versus one bigger one, but it's always an opportunity to learn lessons, and that seems like a good one.
Yeah, and the system that we have in place, the way these heaters are installed, it would not be much more difficult to add 1 or 2 additional heaters. We have the tapping, the pipes in place. It's easy to add another PVC tap. Just cut it, glue it. We're having the gas line calculations completed, so we'll know what we can do. And we're also looking at what the actual heater size needs to be. How many BTUs do we really need? Again, this is 2 million BTUs. We think it's a little oversized. We're thinking the calculations are going to come back in 1.2 million BTU is what, and that's a lot. And it's more how fast do you want temperature recovery? Do you want the heater to run for an hour then shut off for a day, or is it okay if it runs for 4 hours a day?
All right. Well, thanks again for the hard work you're doing on that area. The last one on our list is the proposed 5-year capital improvement plan.
Yes, I've been working with the Reef Brazil. We went back, we looked over the entire capital plan, and we sat down for quite a few hours, and we looked at what should rise to the top. What are the projects that we should be looking at doing in the next 5 years? Come up with a grouping over the next 5 years, trying to lump similar projects together. So when we do go out to bid, that we can take advantage of a larger project to get better pricing on bids. Starting for 2018, what we did is we really looked at the cooling system at Maple Glen. We know that's coming up, so we used the money that was budgeted in the original report, and we came with a goal of about $1.2 million a year in spending on capital. Would get us where we need to be over the next 5 years. So we're including other items, some smaller items as well, as some doors in the classroom doors, taking in our elementary schools, Thomas Fitzwater, Fort Washington, Jarretttown, as well as a $100,000 contingency for any other projects that could pop up as well. 2019, the major project we were looking to undertake is windows at Fort Washington. That one project alone will really take up our entire budgeting for that for that summer. But we also have the $100,000 contingency in there as well. Following year 2020, before we could do any air conditioning at Fort Washington, any increased load, we would have to upgrade that electric service. That's really the last of the older electrical services. So if in 2020, we can tackle that. But going right along with that, we know we're going to be trenching, digging parking lots, so we are going to have paving work that needs to get done. So it was a perfect time to add in any paving needs that we have around the district. Sidewalk repairs, parking lots that need to be resurfaced. Again, since we know we're going to be calling in and bringing in paving contractors, that let's make one big project for them as well. Which jumps us to 2021. And this is where we'd like to see partial air conditioning of these buildings, what we can do. And this is where the feasibility study, so we do have some time with this feasibility study, what we want to do, how we can look into the schools. And the final year, 2022, is more taking on some of the smaller projects, grouping of smaller projects. The one large one would be boilers at Jarretttown, since we do have original boilers. We would be looking at those as a large project. And then there's some bathroom renovations that would need to be done in Fort Washington. Not structural renovations, but more cosmetic renovations, new partitions, fixtures if needed, making repairs.
Okay. One thing I noticed that one thing I noticed that's not on the list is roofing projects. Are we in good shape on our roofs over the next 5 years?
We're in good shape. The only roof that worries me in the district right now is Maple Glen. Main buildings has my biggest concern. We're working to keep that patched. I'm sorry, not Sandy Run. Maple Glen, we've made a lot of repairs. With leaking there is not an issue the way it used to be. The shingles still have good thickness to them. They're not losing the asphalt off the shingles yet. So we figure that's not within a 5-year plan, probably closer to 10 years out.
That's what I thought. I thought you had said around 10 years.
In 10 years, we think we can get out of that.
Right.
There's certain sections have been replaced over the past years that are in good condition, and some of the smaller flat roof areas. When you see the building, you always see the large peaked roofs. Between sections of the building, we have flat roofs, and actually last year we did replace one small section of flat roof. It was just the easiest way to take care of some of the leaks that were going on. So we're confident in that roof. Fort Washington's roof, excellent condition, and Jarretttown as well, and Thomas Fitzwater is in good condition.
Good. That's good. That relieves us of a lot of headaches as far as spending money that can be used in other areas. So that's good. Any other comment or question?
I do have a question. Just in general about the philosophy of using this. I think we've talked about it as being a living document, and I think we need to all agree as to what that means. Those numbers that you put in annually, I mean, this is a projection. This is what we'd like to do, but this isn't carved in stone. I mean,
No.
Things can usurp things easily.
We could have some type of unexpected failure.
Right. And so that would change this.
That would change this. And also, if going through our studies, one of the big areas of going through our studies, if we find out it's not a good idea to put air conditioning till we do more of a renovation on a space, that may move something else that wasn't in the 5-year plan up into the 5-year plan. There's just so many things that could change.
Right. So
that
when we say living document, we mean it's constantly being evaluated, so it can and will change.
Correct. From what I understand, a few years ago, there were issues that popped up. Nobody expected sinkholes opening up at Thomas
Leaking
Fitzwater,
underground storage tanks.
So areas that needed to be replaced, we didn't expect. A project that size could very easily shift priorities of projects.
Right, okay.
I want to call attention, and Bob mentioned it certainly, that there's a contingency of at least $100,000 a year to cover emerging, I'll call them emerging things that need to be addressed in the short term, but are of a capital nature.
This might be a question for the next meeting, but how does this, roughly 1.1 to 1.4 million a year compare to the last few?
I don't know that I would that I had that information for me with me tonight, but certainly we were spending out bond money. The amount of money that we spent on capital projects over the last few years has varied a great deal. As far as an average, this is more than what we have been spending, but we have also been putting aside money in a capital projects fund that will help fund this or pay for it. Not to be redundant within the same sentence, but so we can do a look back on what we have been spending, but do keep in mind that when we do the reflection, it's the bond fund of 2012 that we were finishing up, as well as some money coming out of capital and some money out of operations.
And the expectation for this, and I know it's only expectation and planning, but this is probably mostly going to come out of capital projects, or where do you see this 1.2-ish million a year typically coming from?
Now we definitely are switching
to
over the
finance.
conduit or the
I can
baton
wait.
into finance.
I'll be here.
And but we did have a conversation, talking about what we think our capacity would be, and that's part of the reason why this is going to be a living document. If we have a economic correction or something occurs that we don't have the money to proceed, with out of capital projects, we'll have to consider that. But we've been having a pretty good trend and putting money aside, and $1 million a year. Now, for this type of capital, we also need to plan for $400,000 to $500,000 a year for buses, as we did on Monday nights. So, in my mind, and what we're going to talk about as far as assumptions moving forward, is about $1.5 million a year that we will have for this. There's been conversations about maybe looking at our overall debt or capital and maybe borrowing some money to help expedite some of these more quickly. But that's part of the living and moving forward.
And so what, Bob, are the next steps here? So I imagine there's going to be, over time, fleshing out these round numbers into more specific numbers. There's going to be things that change over time as needs change. But what, in terms of this document, is this, now what you're going to be working from? And so what's the next step from here?
Right now, it's what we're focused on, but I do expect changes. There could be input from other, as everybody looks through it, there may be questions where again, this is a first draft, so there could be questions that, why didn't you pick this project? There could be determination that maybe a project that we didn't pick would supersede something we did pick. So I do expect this to be constantly under review. Where I like the planning, looking forward, I know when we start, if we're talking about windows in 2019, well, late 2018, I'm going to need to start talking to architects and starting to come up with a plan. So this is going to help me look to what my scheduling, what I need to do, who I need to bring on board much earlier than the planned project.
Great. Okay. And so that begs two more questions from me. One is, for the board, or at least this committee, when should we expect to see, are you going to show this to us? Is this just an informational item every month? Is this, you present it to us once a year? How do we foresee that going forward?
Well, tonight Bob started talking about the cooling tower at Maple Glen, and if you look at next year, those two items on the second page, Maple Glen replaced chillers. So, from at least my perspective, we're already getting started on planning the work to be done next summer. We have to do the engineering studies and begin the process with this, with engineering, then write the specifications and bid the project. So that's the largest chunk for next summer. He's already started on it, and that's what we discussed earlier. So,
moving forward, I think as things change, anytime there is a significant change in our schedule, if there's a project that we're expecting, I'll need to bring that up right away if we see that there is going to be a change.
Along with this, so you obviously are going to bring the project to us because you always do.
Correct.
But along with this revised version of this document, so we should expect to see it regularly.
Yes, especially as I bring people on to help design the projects. We're going to need the professional. We're going to need architects, engineers for most of these projects. Some projects looking forward may just be able to go out to co-stars for purchases. So these are all things as they come up and as we start planning. Each step of the way, I'll be bringing to this committee.
Okay. And how about additional columns? So I know that I understand that it is extremely difficult to plan at this level of detail that far out, but some things aren't. We can anticipate in a broad range that a roof lasts a certain number of years and it costs approximately this much. And so we can forecast out at least a placeholder that somewhere in this, 3-year range, we're probably going to be looking at the roof on that particular building, like we just said, 10 years.
Well, right. Or maybe that should be an addendum or a separate document.
Maybe it's a separate document. I don't know what.
Yeah, because this is more working.
Yeah.
And the other one is more.
But I don't want to stop here. Is my point. I would like to have a longer term picture, and I understand it'll have a lot less detail and a lot more fuzziness. But I'd like to see it.
It probably should be another format, like text. like in the next 5 years, here's, the kinds of things we might expect.
Right,
following 5 years.
Or even something along the lines of by building, saying, the roof is this age, the kitchen equipment is this age, the electrical, whatever. It's like giving a.
I'm sure you have that data already. It's a question.
We do have a lot of that with the Dewey report as well, and a lot of the larger items, you can look at lifetime expectancy. I know people always turf field pops to mind, where people you talk 10 years. You always hear that 10-year number, but we take care of our field. We don't let it get abused. We watch what activity is occurring on the field, and I don't think there's any reason why we couldn't look at a 12 to 14-year plan on our field if we're maintaining it and properly using it.
So I'd like to see that in a document. We anticipate 12 to 14 years, and therefore whatever year. Yeah, I'd like to just see that written up.
Would it be
presented periodically?
I'm sorry. Would it be possible, if we have this particular 5-year plan, are we going to put this on our website? And if we did, when we made changes, could we, put it in a different color or, like new or, footnote or something like that, so that it is a living document that anybody could go and look at? Would that make sense? Is that complicated? Is that a problem?
Let us think about that. And it may be simply dating the documents and then showing them as, keeping the first or maybe 3 iterations as,
You mentioned fields. Does the district have an obligation regarding Spark Field? And if so, when does that come up, and is that on this list?
We do have an obligation regarding Spark. It is not on this list because money is already set aside in capital projects. Whenever we talk about that, we discuss that there's $346,000 in that general ballpark put aside or earmarked within capital projects to take care of that. So it's not on the list.
That stack of money has loads of dust on it because we've had that in capital projects for probably 10 years or more.
As long as I've been here.
Yeah.
Bob, the 2017 column, I'm sure we did more. I would think we did more. I'm not sure why are those
This
in
didn't
there?
include anything we've already done. This is looking
Forward.
forward, yes. We're underway right now, and hopefully next month I'll have information for you for bidding.
But- That's what I thought it was, but but when somebody looks at this, they think that's what we did in 2017.
That's why I said maybe a write-up, a description of exactly what this document is, how it will be used, so people really understand what they're looking at.
We could add another section onto the bottom of this as a project is completed, where it drops off and into a different section.
Right.
Don't we? Isn't there a list of all those things in the larger capital plan document
Yes.
that we
Yes.
saw at
Work
the
is
legislative
linked
meeting?
together, yes.
So, maybe just noting that, all those things are listed in another place, and
Yeah,
maybe it's in the same document, maybe not. I don't know.
I'm not sure about this 2017 column, because if somebody's just looking at it, they can misinterpret what that column is. But I also need to remind everybody, the very top of this report, or the spreadsheet, it does talk about the Sandy Run Middle School project, talks about a transportation facility that's still to be determined, and then the stadium that when we did the artificial turf, we did defer some other projects that the stadium may eventually need. I think the most important one out of those 3 would be the stadium lights. And I think, am I correct that that's starting to get worse and the lights are going back?
I think your Director of Facilities and Business Administrator both agree that the lights are something that we do need to address.
Right. So at a point when we talk about a living document, if additional monies come in, there's those stadium lights may be something that goes up in priority, because we didn't prioritize when we're going to do those, nor did we indicate that they would be done. I just want to point that out. The other The only other concern that I have is I wish that we can move up the air conditioning to an earlier year in this sequence and not wait until 2021. And just something to think about.
Right, and looking at the big problem I have is before I could do the air conditioning,
The
I need
electrical
to
at
get the
Fort
electrical
Washington.
taken care of at Fort
So
Washington.
you have to move that up, right?
And if we did other schools, we'd probably get a not as good of a price at Fort Washington if we did that as a separate year from the other schools.
Fort Washington's the only building that needs an electrical update, right?
Correct.
This would be
Right
like,
now.
like what
Right
they
now.
did
Right
at
now.
Thomas Fitz.
Right now.
Yes.
So we
Yeah.
did Fitz, right?
Yeah, Fort Washington did receive a generator, so it wouldn't be as involved as Thomas Fitz.
Okay.
But the main switch coming in is still the original
Right.
capacities originally for the way the school was built.
Okay, and Jarretttown?
Jarretttown, I don't know exactly when that was upgraded. I don't know if it was upgraded during one of the additions, but it is a newer service than the age of the building.
Okay. Thank you.
And
Just
cer-
I'm sorry. Just piggybacking on what Art said, a simple solution to the 2017 column is just call it fall 2017.
Thank you. The other thing we could do is probably put an asterisk and indicate that we did Thomas Fitzwater work, and the total amount of work that we did there this summer, and people could total the difference between fall and the
Right.
summer project. So, and that would save us from having to go back and put in additional lines and all of that.
So the only other comment is when somebody asks you how you came up with this list, and it's only 6.2 million close over 5 years. Did the list come up based on money, or did it really come up based on what needs to be done over the next 5 years?
I started this out looking at what I would expect need to be completed over the next 5 years, and we only picked projects that would not be affected in any way by any future renovations. There's some projects in here they don't make sense to unless you're doing a large grouping. One of the items that was on the capital list was put sprinkler systems into the buildings. Well, it doesn't make sense to do it if you're pulling out the ceilings a couple years later.
Or lighting,
You're just-
right?
Lighting as well. These are all things that you would lump into one larger project. So we looked at those issues that would be taking down a major renovation. What would we be doing then? And we didn't consider those during the first 5 years, but looked at what do we need and what's feasible for us to get accomplished.
Yeah, that, you said you did that with Arif.
But yes, Arif
You
and I sat
said-
down.
Yeah.
And just to clarify that implies that we're not looking at any major, not that I thought we were, but we're not looking at any major renovations in the next 5 years.
Correct.
Well, I don't know what word to use. Maybe it's not major, but significant groupings of large capital projects.
Unless the transportation facility comes in. I'm just kidding.
Okay. Any other comment or question before we close this point of discussion? All right, let's move to, well, there's no transportation report, so that brings us to community input. If anyone would like to address the committee, please step to the podium, state your name, section of the township in which you live, and the 4-minute rule is in effect. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Dana Breslin. I'm from Fort Washington. I know the heater. I'm wondering, is there a way to work on it daily? I went on their website. They do have training sessions. And then have them be the, or another option, are we looking at a different, still want to go with Lac Navarre, or do we want to find a different heating manufacturer? So, I mean, that's questions that need to be answered and addressed, at least thought about. Because if our pool goes down, not only does it affect our swim team, our water polo team, sub teams, but it affects revenue because we have a lot of people that rent that pool. Down, Wissahickons building a beautiful pool. We're going to go right up the road, and we'll never get another penny. So that's something I think we should all, with all the changes that are wanted to address is my daughter has been swimming on the team for a few years. Says every morning when she gets in the shower, showers are scalding hot. There's no difference. If anyone else has addressed that at all, or if she's even.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no one else coming to the podium, we'll close community input. And Bob, did you want to address the pool issue again?
Yes. First, I'll talk about the training. And I've had people bring this up to me before. Why don't we have our people trained, especially when it comes up to preventive maintenance? I've been asked before, why do you go outside for preventive maintenance? Why don't you just train your people in-house? Through my experience, I don't want somebody who's only looking at this particular piece of equipment maybe once, twice, 4 times a year tops. On a piece of equipment like this, I'm looking for the person who's working on it every day. Somebody who's working for a service company, they see this constantly. They have direct ties back to the company as well. It's one of the issues. If we're working on it by ourselves, the Lochinvar is less likely to want to talk to us if we call up their service tech. They want to talk to an authorized dealer. I have many items throughout the building, just even things I work on throughout other hobbies where people just won't talk to me because I'm not an authorized service rep. They won't sell me parts. So that is one of the issues that I run into. But I'm really looking for that person who knows the nuances of that type of equipment, who's trained on it, and it's not as much, they forget what you're trained if you don't use it all the time. The people we use, this is the type of equipment, we use R.J. Walters, who's a local rep for this. We use diversified refrigeration for others because they're the people who see this equipment on a daily basis. They can make a diagnosis that would only come through experience. Experience really is a factor in this. So we could provide training all we want to people, but unless you're physically hands-on doing it on a daily basis, you tend to forget, you tend to miss things. I've tried that in the past with people, and it came back to bite me, frankly, because they made problems worse. Just because they aren't used to working on commercial, especially commercial equipment. Residential, yes, it's much simpler, but when you get into the commercial equipment, it's much easier to make a mistake that's going to start you down a line damaging the equipment.
You also did say we're considering not using them anymore.
Yes, that is
because
one of the options on the table. Be frank, I'm not happy with their equipment at all. So that is one of the things. We are looking at the different manufacturers. What's out there? What has a better reputation? Is there different materials? Do we look at titanium heat exchangers versus Cooper nickel versus copper? These are all the things that they're taking into consideration.
Yeah, I would really go after them on the warranty thing, and I would not use them again.
And they make it difficult to go after them for the warranty.
I know.
The only way they will address your warranty is if you package up the coil and ship it to them, and they'll evaluate it in their factory with their people. So it's
right.
All the
More
reason
reason to
get
have a
a
heavily
different
redundant
one.
system
Yeah.
with
when you have a piece of equipment that weighs 1,000 pounds and you're paying to ship it halfway across the country for somebody to take a look at, you probably just half the value of that coil is already paid for just in shipping it back, just to hear them say no for many reasons, and you have to try to fight them on that. So that's why we brought reps in here trying to get an answer. I wasn't happy with our meeting, so I'm waiting to see what their final report is going to be.
I think most everyone around the table knows I'm not reluctant to go after warranties or whatever, but we
No.
do have to look at it from a cost-benefit situation. So Bob and I have discussed this several times, and I'm not saying that it's out of the realm of possibilities, but we don't need to be, spending money if it doesn't look like it's going to be a payback. To me, that just means it's a really good reason to look at another vendor to provide the equipment.
Absolutely.
And I worry about the chain of custody once it leaves my hands. It's out of my hands. I'll never have it back. So if something comes up in the future, I no longer have it. It's gone. I don't. It's tough to document it. I can't cut it apart and look at it myself before they get hold of it. So I'm taking their word on it. Whoever opens it up at the factory. So yes, we are definitely considering other heating manufacturers. And in terms of scalding hot, I was not aware of any issues. We do have mixing valves for the water. I'll send the plumber first thing tomorrow morning and check on that.
All right, good. Any other comment or question before we close? All right, our next Operations Committee meeting will be Thursday, October 26th at 6 p.m. right here in the beautiful Upper Dublin Cardinal Room. All right, thank you all, and we are adjourned.
I'm working on that right now.